You are catching some Brainwaves, the podcast aimed at making us all more informed, inspired, and connected educators. And on this episode, we are bringing you yet another metaphoric giant in education. She's Natalie Wexler, and she literally wrote the book on how we can make kids better readers. And the topic of reading has really been blowing my mind recently. I mean, it's crazy to think about. How do we as humans take a bunch of ink blots on a page and make meaning from those symbols to unlock the entire world? Reading is so much more than a skill, and it cannot be boiled down to a set of skills. It's really actually a superpower. And no matter what age or subject we teach, we all have so much to learn about how we can do it better.
Yes, we definitely can do it better. And according to Dr. Wexler and many others out there, we need to do it better. We know from the data that students who aren't on grade level reading by third grade are 4 times less likely to graduate from high school, and poverty only compounds that issue. I just saw a headline in the New York Times from last month that said reading scores on national exams decline in half the states. You find this kind of trend all over the place. Our reading scores are dropping, and that's despite the fact that, according to Dr. Wexler's research, we're spending more time on reading instruction than ever. The typical third grade student in an American classroom spends 2 hours a day on reading instruction.
Yeah, and so the big question really is why, and we really need to uncover this one layer at a time. Why, when we're spending more time on reading instruction than ever, are our scores declining? And the conclusion that Natalie Wexler arrives at after reporting on the subject, interviewing cognitive scientists, reading research, and scouring the globe for schools closing the knowledge gap is that we're focusing on the wrong thing. Reading comprehension cannot be broken down into discrete skills like main idea or inferencing. Instead, our goal should be to increase background knowledge and vocabulary for our students so that they have that knowledge to Velcro onto. She lays out such a compelling point that the key to understanding what you read is to have solid background knowledge on that subject.
Yeah, for sure. And I have to take this opportunity to tell a quick story. Brainwaves is kind of my safe place. I can admit stuff to these connected educators that I'd probably be embarrassed to tell all my bros at the gym before I lift like 400 pounds on the bench press.
Obviously.
I don't really have bros at a gym, but you know what I mean. Teachers are some of the most appreciative folks of learning. And as teachers, we all have those moments, those 2 or 3 moments a year where you're just like wowed by learning. You get those goosebumps, your jaw's on the floor. You're so impressed with a transformation a kid has made. You see a kid take learning in one area and apply it to another area of life, and you're just like floored. Do you know what I'm talking about, Becky?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So over Thanksgiving break, I had one of those moments with my daughter, Grace, and she is in kindergarten now. And we were doing the typical go around and share what you're thankful for. And my daughter, Grace, said, "I'm thankful for the Pilgrims." And I definitely had never talked to her about the Pilgrims or, ever mentioned them to her, which is embarrassing because I'm a history major. But we started diving more and asked her okay, why are you thankful for them? And she's like, well, they took a tremendous risk to come to this world. And did you know they weren't even supposed to be on the Mayflower? Their original voyage was on a ship called the Speedwell. And the Speedwell was a transportation vessel, and they could have had their own rooms. But the Mayflower was a commercial vessel, and so they didn't even have their own rooms, and half the people on the Mayflower perished. And it's all this amazing vocab that, she's using words like perished and motivation and voyage and commercial. And she has this robust set of content now that when she goes to read a book, she now has kind of a leg up. And so that's it totally, as I was listening to Natalie Wexler, made me think I'm really thankful that my daughter's teacher doesn't focus on text features and captions and table of contents, but really has immersed her in content that's enthralling to her. So shout out, Miss Belinsky. You're the best.
Wow, that is an awesome story. And it reminds me, I was reading a blog from Daisy Christodoulou, who wrote Making Good Progress and 7 Myths About Education. And it's all about, things like that. Kids love stories. History is all stories. Yeah. And even too, that you might not be able to see some of the gaps, my kindergarten student who doesn't know about those things, in I don't know, 10th grade or something, that might start to be where it surfaces, that there's that gap in between those two. It's not really always apparent right then. We're so excited to introduce Natalie Wexler, who is a lawyer, a legal historian, a journalist with education-focused op-eds that have been published in New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and pretty much every other major newspaper. She's an author of several books, most recently, The Knowledge Gap, which I would highly encourage all of you to pick up. So without further ado, here she is. I devoured your book a couple weeks ago and just have really gone back to it and read a number of the things over and over. And I kind of want to distill one thing before we get started into really getting deep into knowledge gap and talking about reading comprehension and everything. What do you feel is the promise of public education to our communities, our states, our nation? And are we, do you think, on the whole, living up to that promise or not?
Well, I'd have to say on the whole, whatever the promise is, the American education system is not living up to it. I mean, I think people have asked me, what do you see as the purpose of education? And I think there are multiple purposes, but if you look at any of them, it for many kids, it's not happening, whether it is self-fulfillment, whether it's the ability to contribute productively to society, to have a comfortable life. And frankly, the one that is perhaps most compelling to me, although they're all important, is that if we're going to have a functioning democracy, we need to have a citizenry that can understand a newspaper or even just, a TV or radio news report, or really, perhaps most crucially these days, what they come across on the internet when they have to be, not only a good reader, but really act as their own editors and fact checkers. And if you don't have a good base of knowledge of the world, that's a very challenging thing to do. And I think, I'm not blaming anyone, but for various systemic reasons, we are not turning out high school graduates or even college graduates who are well equipped to do that kind of analysis.
We are not turning out students who are able to do that kind of analysis, and you diagnose the reason for that as the knowledge gap. So how do you define the knowledge gap, and why do we have it?
It's a play on the phrase achievement gap, and it refers to this, what's really a test score gap between children of what it boils down to is more educated parents and children of less educated parents. And that correlates in our society very highly with other more frequently used measures like income and to some extent, a large extent, race. And, it's largely because of a misunderstanding about what goes into reading comprehension. We have treated, or schools have treated reading comprehension as though it were a set of discrete skills like finding the main idea or making inferences, and having kids practice those skills and making content knowledge really secondary. And the theory is that eventually they'll be able to use those skills to gain knowledge through their own reading. And this is been around for a long time, but it's really intensified in the last 20 years as we've had high stakes reading tests come in that really, that's what they seem to be asking for is, can you find the main idea of this disconnected passage that you may not really know anything about from school, certainly. But the problem is that cognitive scientists have known for a long time now that the most important factor in whether you can understand what you're reading is how much background knowledge and vocabulary you have relating to the topic. And I think that, in some ways that's common sense. I mean, if you think about trying to read a paragraph on a topic you're unfamiliar with, like that is pretty technical or abstruse, like if I tried to read the abstract of an article on microbiology, I would clearly have to struggle to make sense of it. I think what many adults don't realize is how many concepts and how many words children from less educated families are unfamiliar with. So we have been doubling down on these reading comprehension skills, especially with the kids who lack the background knowledge to make sense of the passages on the reading test, because we think, well, they chose B instead of C because they didn't have enough practice with main idea, when in fact, the problem may well be that they could not understand the reading passage in the first place because of gaps in their background knowledge, especially relative to their luckier peers from more educated families.
You referenced the baseball study, and that really helped it hit home for me, kind of understanding the root of this problem.
No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. Just hit a home run on that one. Could you explain that study to our listeners and how we should use the results of that study to change how we teach reading?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is often a powerful study to share with people. This was done back in the late 1980s, so quite a while ago now. A couple of young researchers wanted to test out what's more important in reading comprehension. Is it general comprehension skills, or is it background knowledge of the topic? And they chose the topic of baseball because they figured, there are a lot of kids who are not generally good readers, but they know a lot about baseball. And they went into a junior high school and divided 7th and 8th graders into 4 groups, depending on how well they had tested on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And what they found was that the kids who knew a lot about baseball did really well when they tested them on a passage about a baseball game, regardless of how well they had scored on that standardized reading comprehension test. So the poor, quote unquote, poor readers who knew a lot about baseball did almost as well as the quote unquote good readers who knew a lot about baseball. On the other hand, the kids who didn't know much about baseball all scored pretty poorly on this comprehension test about baseball, regardless of how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test. So it's pretty convincing evidence that background knowledge is more important than some general reading comprehension skill. And this study has been replicated in a number of other contexts.
Interesting. And you go on to talk in the book too about how like the 2 basic components of reading, there's decoding and then there's comprehension, and how those have been kind of lumped together, or we look at comprehension as that discrete set of skills, kind of like we would in math or in decoding. Why have they been lumped together like that? And why is that a dangerous approach?
Yeah. I mean, it's, I've been hearing more and more about these states passing these laws saying if you don't test well on a reading test at 3rd grade, then you have to be held back. And the problem is those reading tests don't distinguish between these 2 aspects of reading. So you don't know if a 3rd grader doesn't pass a reading test and that it's a reading comprehension test. It's unclear whether it's a decoding problem or a comprehension problem. And these things have been lumped together, the decoding and the comprehension, for a long time now. So we've had this, sort of reading has been treated as a subject that includes both of those, although in many cases there's more time spent on the comprehension aspect than the decoding aspect. I came across a cognitive psychologist who observed that teachers and cognitive scientists who study reading and reading comprehension have come to really distinctly opposite conclusions about what goes into each of these things, decoding and comprehension. Teachers, especially, when the whole language movement was dominant, and to some extent this is still true, have seen decoding as something that if you just surround kids with enough books and literature, they'll pick it up. Whereas scientists have seen this as most kids, probably, at least 50%, actually, if they're going to become good decoders, they need to be explicitly taught how to do that, how to sound out words, how to use phonics in a systematic way. On the other hand, comprehension, teachers have come to this view of, that actually needs to be explicitly taught as a set of skills, whereas cognitive scientists have come to the conclusion that really that's what grows naturally. If you build kids' knowledge, then comprehension will grow naturally alongside of it. So we're at this very dysfunctional point where teachers seem to, because of deficiencies in their training, really, and the materials they get, they have not gotten the really accurate information that would really help them that cognitive scientists have come up with.
And I want to drill down on that a little bit more too, because when I think about the kind of reading tests that we believe are testing comprehension, would you say then that they're not really testing comprehension, they're really just testing the degree of background knowledge?
Well, not completely, but it is a huge factor. In fact, Dan Willingham, who is a cognitive psychologist who's written a lot about reading comprehension, has called standardized reading tests knowledge tests in disguise. And there are some studies that show a very high correlation between how much general knowledge you have about, the world, about history and culture, and how well you do on a standardized reading test. And this, it's really important, and I'm sure teachers are aware of this, but the general public sometimes is not, that standardized reading tests don't attempt to assess kids' comprehension based on anything that they may have been taught in school. I mean, there's really an effort to avoid that because you don't want to give some kids an unfair advantage. So they really try to choose topics that kids would have, things about hurricanes or whatever, things they would have picked up outside of school. And they try to compensate. So if they have a question about hurricanes, well, kids in the southern part of the country will probably know more about those. So they'll balance it with a question about blizzards for the kids in the northern part of the country. But kids who are generally lacking in knowledge and vocabulary are always going to be penalized, no matter how much you try to jigger that, And the way to really level the playing field would be to actually use reading passages that are on topics kids have all had a chance to learn about in school.
Yeah, Daniel Willingham is a friend of the pod.
Yeah, we had him on a while ago. He actually came out and did a PD too for our district. It was amazing.
Well, great. He's done a lot to spread the word about this. Yeah.
So one of the questions I've had is, I totally agree now after reading your book and listening to you on a bunch of other podcasts that we need to give students way more background knowledge in these times to enrich, or really dive into the content. But how do we decide what knowledge is important then to immerse students in? It's like an infinite amount. How do we know if should they be reading about the Ukrainian potato famine? How do we decide what are those rich knowledge they need to absorb?
Well, and that is a question that comes up a lot. And it's not like there's, a finite list of things that all kids should learn. There are different bodies of knowledge that could be covered, and there are different ways to build that knowledge. And I think, there are now several content-focused knowledge-building elementary literacy curricula available. I think it's really hard for teachers either to make that kind of decision themselves or to implement it, because knowledge building is a gradual, cumulative process, and you really need, somebody who's been sort of trained in developing curriculum, but also can have an overarching concept of, where is all this leading to? I think that's ideal. But to get at your question about, who decides, as I said, I think there are many good decisions, but I do think we ought to keep in mind, what do we want kids when they graduate from high school? What do we want them to be able to do? If we want them to I would say we would want them to understand a news report. We would want them to be able to make informed decisions in elections and all of that. So what do they need to know about America and about the world in order to understand a newspaper, to understand issues in an election? And where we are now is so far from that, especially in high poverty schools. I have talked to many teachers in high poverty high schools who have told me, and I've seen this to some extent for myself, that they have kids in high school who, don't know the difference between a city and a state, don't know the difference between a country and a continent, cannot find the United States on a map of the world or where they live on a map of the United States. And I think we can all agree that those things, at the very least, are things that all kids should be learning in school.
And why, to me, when I first heard about the Common Core, I thought that is what it was going to be. Hey, here are the general pieces of knowledge we feel like every graduate in the country should know about. And when I look at it, a lot of times it's just like a list of the skills that you say we shouldn't just be teaching in isolation.
It does look like that when you look at the standards. One of the misconceptions about the Common Core is that it's a curriculum, but it is in fact just standards. And for political reasons, the drafters of the Common Core felt they couldn't include in the literacy standards really any particular content. They really wanted to stay away from that because there had been, back in the 90s, there had been political battles over content-focused standards. So, teachers and educators have looked at those standards themselves and thought, well, this is a list of skills. I should teach these standards. I should, especially if you're used to teaching literacy as a set of skills or reading comprehension as a set of skills. This looked like, well, same kind of thing, but maybe some new skills like connecting a claim to evidence in text, or the skill of reading nonfiction text, which is not really a generally applicable skill. The drafters of the literacy standards actually wanted to get schools, to get educators away from that skills-focused approach to comprehension. And they didn't put that in the standards themselves. They did include language in the supplemental materials that said essentially, if you want kids to meet these standards, if you want them to, for example, be able to read and understand complex nonfiction text, then you need to start building their knowledge through a coherent, content-focused curriculum beginning in elementary school. But many people never read that language in the supplemental materials.
Right. Yeah. And it strikes me too, because even the need for that vertical alignment to have that sort of end goal, you need to have the big picture from what does it look like from kindergarten all the way up through 14. And so when like an individual teacher in an individual school maybe grabs onto this and starts trying to do that in her classroom or his classroom, it might really go wayward because that vertical alignment isn't there.
Teachers are just told, okay, here's a new thing, do this. They're very used to hearing that.
Right.
And if they don't understand why, they can do what teachers have historically done, which is to close the classroom door and do what makes sense to them. So I think teachers also need to be convinced and to understand why this change is not only makes sense, but it's really necessary if they want to see the results we all like to see, and it actually would make their jobs easier ultimately. And I do think that one thing that can be really helpful is, and it may not always be possible, but for teachers, for administrators to go to a school or a district even that has been successfully implementing this new kind of approach for a couple of years maybe, and to see it in action, because I think they'll see the teachers really like it, the students really like it, the parents really like it, the kids are actually learning a lot.
The way you say it is that the kids are clamoring for broccoli and spinach while adults insist on a steady diet of donuts. That I think that's such a nice analogy for the necessity for us to push more content and give students that broccoli and spinach that they so want in early elementary grades. I wonder what your message would be to elementary teachers just about maybe student readiness. Another thing that comes through a lot in your book is how regularly and easily and almost unconsciously we underestimate the capabilities of our students. Can you talk a little bit about that and how teachers come to that realization, but how could we do that on a more accelerated level?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ironic because I've seen, there's all this talk about high expectations, and I've seen teachers, trying to have those kinds of expectations, but they're like these metacognitive things that it's very hard maybe for first graders to do, to care about, like trying to get them to understand the difference between a caption and a subtitle, which is a fairly abstract thing. I think where we've been underestimating kids is that in their interest in and ability to handle subjects like historical topics or non-hands-on topics in science. Kids, and we really, this is a tremendous wasted opportunity because, little kids that we know are like sponges. They also really love a good story. They don't necessarily care what it's about as long as it's a good story. And history, which many teachers feel is developmentally inappropriate for kids under maybe fourth grade, history can be told as a very engaging series of stories, and kids really get into them. And, they actually love feeling like they're experts. They love learning stuff. So, I think that this misconception that kids are only going to be interested maybe in things that relate to themselves, their own lives, that they can't handle history or non-hands-on science because it's too abstract, that has been where we've underestimated them. But then, we're trying to teach them that fantasy is a subgenre of fiction rather than nonfiction in first grade. And that, in a way that's expecting too much because it really doesn't interest them and it is really abstract.
Yeah, along those lines, where does choice fall in this continuum? And I guess what have you seen in researching, how student choice plays into this? Just this idea that hey, we'll give you leveled text and you can go read about whatever you choose or...
Yeah. Yes, and I know there's a big premium put on that, and there's certainly some role for student choice. But I think what it overlooks is that for many kids, they don't know what they might be interested in. They don't know yet about, the War of 1812, which I saw a lot of kids get very interested in, or they don't know about dinosaurs or whatever. So, and just expect them, especially with nonfiction topics, to choose things that would interest them and be able to essentially educate themselves enough that they can understand texts independently on those subjects. Again, that's, that's kind of unrealistic. I think kids, yes, they can make choices. That there's a place for that in the school day, but I think we've kind of fetishized choice and underestimated how interested kids can get in things they aren't necessarily already interested in because they don't know about them yet.
100%. Yeah, as you've been saying this, I think it's going to be so freeing for a teacher to hear, because if you're enriching a kid in a story, you're not going to have like the classroom management that you might have when you're saying like, hey, here's a caption.
Yeah.
Exactly. But it's like my
Yeah.
daughter's in kindergarten and she's getting fired up about things that I would have thought she had no interest in because her teacher makes it about a story. And so I think you're so right that when we give choice, especially at those younger ages, they're just going to choose what they already know, which is further going to exacerbate this problem.
Right. And it widens the gap, isn't it? The kids that get hurt the most are the ones that aren't coming in with background knowledge.
Yes, definitely. But just to the behavior point, I mean, I've talked to some teachers in a number of schools who have said when they switched to a content-focused model rather than the skills-first model, that behavior incidents significantly decreased. And I've seen that in schools where, there might be a kid who's potentially disruptive, but he gets interested in something and he's able to contribute to the class discussion. And he sits, all of a sudden he stops wandering around the classroom, So yes, and it definitely does. The choice thing can really exacerbate these gaps. There's this thing I don't think we've mentioned yet, known as the Matthew effect in reading. And that is a reference to the line in the Gospel of Matthew that essentially means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And in reading, what it refers to is the kids who start out with more knowledge and vocabulary are able to read more complex text and absorb more information, because that also knowledge doesn't just help with comprehension. If you know something about the topic, you're also more likely to remember the new information you're getting. And so with every passing year, they get further and further ahead. Meanwhile, the kids who start out with less knowledge and vocabulary, if they're not getting their knowledge built from school, they're usually relegated to, the lower reading levels, and they're reading simple text, and they're not getting exposed to those more complex concepts and more complex vocabulary. And so every year they fall farther and farther behind. And so that gap, the longer you wait to start trying to narrow it, the harder it is.
Kind of goes with your quote in your book where you said leveled texts lead to leveled lives. But I love that idea of I don't love it, but yeah, I totally resonate with that.
And I just, to give credit where credit is due, I don't know him, but that was originally said by a reading expert named Alfred Tatum. I think it's a great line, but I don't want to take credit for it.
It gives me a knot in my stomach, right?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Yeah, 100%. One thing you said earlier that I'm a little curious about, you said that you think it'd be great for people to go and see these new changes happening in schools. And is it really a new thing? Because to me, like, my grandma taught in a one-room schoolhouse, and she would tell stories about like how she would, it was all about the content then. Is this a new idea, or is this really just hearkening back to how it used to be?
Well, I think, there used to be more content. I think for a long time, reading comprehension. I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, there were reading comprehension textbooks with, sort of skills focused questions like, can you find the main idea of this passage? But there was more time in the school day for things like social studies and science and the arts and literature. So I think kids did get more of it. Although really going back to the 20s and 30s, social studies in the early elementary grades has been very superficial, and the theory has been, as I mentioned before, that kids are really only going to be interested in learning about their lives, their families, their communities, and so this idea that we don't start teaching history at that point goes back a long way, and I think that really can put kids at a disadvantage if they're not learning anything about just the concept of history, that there was such a thing as the past outside of school. So I would say that's been a problem for a long time. And I think, yes, things were better in terms of there being more content, but in the later 20th century, certainly the 50s, 60s, into the 70s to some extent, we did have a lot of tracking at the high school level. And, there were some kids who managed to, if they were from less educated or low income families, they managed to get in the college prep track. But in many cases, they were kind of told, no, you're on the vocational track. And so this idea that everybody should be college and career ready, and career meaning, something that actually requires a certain amount of knowledge and skills, so you'll be able to understand an instruction manual on the job. That, I think, is relatively new, because it used to be that you could get a pretty good job with an 8th grade education, in manufacturing, and that's really not true anymore. So I think we do need to ask even more of our schools than we used to. And unfortunately, our schools are not doing as much as they used to along these lines.
And those fixed groupings, I mean, that goes all the way back to elementary school, right? Like, I mean, I heard one of our English language arts coordinators call it the other day, like, think about like red birds and bluebirds, or like the L group and the M group or whatever. I mean, it starts really early, and then it's really hard to get students out of those things. What's the alternative to that for teachers in elementary classrooms?
Well, I mean, the first step would be to, as I said, have a content-focused curriculum that is organized by topics rather than by skills. And so then, and then all children are going to be exposed to the same content, not just a mini lesson on the skill of the week. They'll be certainly in the lower elementary grades, and I would argue even beyond the lower elementary grades, there would be a read aloud on that topic that is from a text that students could not read independently, because listening comprehension exceeds reading comprehension really on average through middle school. And also because written text, written language is almost always more complex than spoken language. So kids need to be hearing that more complex syntax and language and those concepts, so that eventually when they do become independent readers, they will be familiar with them. But so they'll be, the entire class would hear this read aloud, and there would be pauses for discussion and good questions that, elicit that discussion. And I think certainly starting in 3rd grade, if not before, there's also a place for writing about whatever the topic is, whatever the content is. And that's a whole other issue that we maybe could talk about. But
yes,
we will. We will.
Okay.
We're going to keep you for like 3 days, if that's cool.
You are now our hostage.
But just on that, I do want to say, there is also obviously a place, certainly for teaching kids decoding, kindergarten through 2nd grade especially, and also for kids to have some time, maybe, half an hour for independent reading, but it doesn't they should not be limited to the level L or whatever, they've been determined to be, because those reading levels are really artificial constructs. As we know from the baseball study, a kid's reading level is going to vary with the extent of his or her knowledge of the topic. So what kids should be getting is, they can have some free choice, but I think also among their choices should certainly be books relating to the topic that they have been hearing about and discussing. And there should maybe be some graduated levels of texts on that particular topic, so that they can start at the easiest level, but when they're more familiar with the topic, then they can move up through those levels. That's what's going to get them to move up through the levels, not these random topics that are only organized by measures like sentence length and things that have nothing to do with the content.
Why is it so important to give struggling readers grade level material? Because that's, we get pushback about that sometimes. And I totally understand the reason, especially for an 8th grade teacher who's got a kid reading at 2nd grade level in her classroom. Why is it so important for them to give those types of students grade level material? And how do we make that accessible for them when it's sometimes like a number of grade levels below their ability or above their ability?
Yeah. And I really sympathize with teachers at higher grade levels who have kids with significant, there may be partly a decoding problem, but also significant gaps in their background knowledge. But if an 8th grader never grapples with an 8th grade level text, and then at the end of the year takes, a state standardized reading test that has 8th grade level text on it, how is that kid going to even begin to access that text unless he or she has seen that kind of text before. So, but that doesn't mean just hand the kid an 8th grade level text when the kid is reading at what is determined to be a 2nd or 3rd grade level. I think this is where this, sort of close reading of complex text comes in. And I have some problems with that, with really elevating that, because, if you don't have the background knowledge, a quick injection of, okay, well, here's what you need to know before you can read this text. That kind of quick injection of knowledge is unlikely to stick. And it is also, it's going to be a very heavy lift. The teacher may end up having to do much of the work if the kid is not familiar with complex syntax and things like that. But I do think that working through it together as a class and ensuring that kids, maybe they're not going to get every nuance, but they will realize that, yes, you can, if you work at it, you can wrest meaning from text that could look impenetrable at first glance. I think that's important.
That's right. That's awesome.
So I'm an instructional technology coordinator. I know my way around a keyboard, that's for sure. I spent a lot of time at just different tech conferences. And I think part of the reason we're at this place we are now is that people say like, hey, we're walking around with supercomputers and Google. We don't need to focus on facts and knowledge. And you do an amazing job of putting that argument to bed. So will you do that for us?
Yes. Sure. Although I have to say, a lot of this is taken from Dan Willingham because
that's cool.
He
we'll
did
tell
it before
him.
me.
Yeah.
But
we'll text him. We will text him. Okay.
I do like to try to give.
Yeah.
I mean, I stand on a lot of shoulders.
Totally.
Yes.
Totally.
But and also this argument predates modern technology. This idea that now we say you could just Google it. Back in the 1920s, it was being said, well, why teach it if you can just look it up in the encyclopedia, right?
Right.
But there are several problems with that approach. I mean, one is the burden that puts on your working memory, on your cognitive capacity, if you have to keep stopping as you're reading to puzzle over the meanings of words and concepts and actually break off to look them up, you're going to lose the thread of what you're reading. Working memory can only hold a certain number of things for a limited period of time. So every time you break off to think about the meaning or to look something up, even worse, the harder it's going to be for you to understand what you're trying to read. Another problem is that if you don't have the background knowledge to understand, a number of things in what you're reading, you may not have the background knowledge to understand the definitions of those things either. Or you may, words, even simple words like apple or charge, have multiple meanings, and you could, find the wrong meaning for the context that the word is being used in. So there are numerous problems with that mantra about, well, why teach it if you can just Google it? It's really, I think, as Dan Willingham would say, it's really a dangerous idea that has gotten around.
Do you think that has to do with cursive knowledge too? Like we sometimes look at like Civil War or, some of these things that we think are just kind of, we take that knowledge for granted. But if we were to, like you said before, put like a microbiology text in front of us and then we forced ourselves to go and Google everything, like, don't you think some of that is about our cognitive bias, about like the ease or the level of some of these concepts?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I interviewed Doug Lemov for the book, and he said, and another great quote, he said, those of us on the privileged side of the knowledge gap have no idea how we got here.
And that's right.
And we also have really often no idea how big that gap is. We just assume a lot of, well, we know it. It doesn't everybody. And I think that's one of the things that's really hard for teachers whose kids have not come up through a coherent, content-focused curriculum. It's very hard to know what they're going to know. Some of them will know something, but others won't. And I, for example, was in a 2nd grade classroom where the teacher was really trying to do a content-focused lesson on slavery, but he had chosen a fairly sophisticated text for this was, low income, all children of color from less educated families. It was really, it was written for children, but it was more about the economics of slavery, the differences between slavery in the North, slavery in the South. And after 20 minutes of these kids really struggling with this text, the teacher discovered they didn't know what slavery meant.
Mm.
They thought the slaves got paid. So,
Wow.
so it is hard to know what to assume. And the best way to avoid making those kinds of mistakes is to provide all kids with, the same body of knowledge as much as possible.
That's right. And I think sometimes we overlook the value of pre-assessments for some of that stuff because I'm going to teach this unit, but my kids don't know anything about this yet. But they might have misconceptions about it.
Yes.
That's an important step to take. I would love it if you could discuss another thing for us, the misinterpretation of Bloom's taxonomy and how that's been harmful to classrooms. I'm fascinated by this, and it's not something we talk about a lot. So I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, I had never heard of Bloom's taxonomy, not having had a background in education. So, but this was actually, I think Doug Lemov and I came to this at just about the same time we were emailing, and he had come to this realization just like a day after I had come to it independently. But, this is taught, I guess, in just about every teacher training program. That Benjamin Bloom has this sort of, it's presented as a pyramid of aspects of cognition or learning. And at the bottom, there's like comprehension and knowledge. And then at the top, there is like analysis and synthesis. And so the ones at the top are referred to as higher order thinking, and those at the bottom, lower order. And the way this is usually interpreted is, well, why waste time with those lower order thinking aspects of cognition like comprehension and knowledge? Let's just go straight to those wonderful higher order thinking and just teach kids how to think critically, or just ask them to synthesize. But that, of course, is really not what Benjamin Bloom meant. He meant that before you can get to analyzing and synthesizing, you have to pass through the stages of comprehension and knowledge. There's no way to think critically or analyze something that you basically don't understand.
Yeah, it's a taxonomy, not a hierarchy. And we look at it like that. We look at it as because of the way it's written too. Like it looks like a hierarchy. I get that. But yeah, I think that misinterpretation has been really detrimental, especially to many of the things that we've been talking about, because we gloss over those things so quickly so that we can get to the better, quote unquote, better things at the top, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's like the slavery thing. He didn't want to waste time on explaining slavery.
Right.
But,
right.
Yeah.
Well, you also are the co-author of a great book called The Writing Revolution. And you actually say that writing, and this was kind of counterintuitive for me, I thought writing was a way of showing what you knew, but you talk about how writing can actually build that base of knowledge. So how can writing solidify knowledge for students?
Well, of course, it's both. I mean, it's intimately bound up with knowledge. You need a certain amount of knowledge of a topic before you can write coherently about it. And that's one difficulty with trying to teach writing in a skills-focused elementary classroom, is that kids don't have enough knowledge of any particular topic to really even write a good sentence or two about it. But the other thing that writing, the other relationship it has to knowledge, is that in the process of writing, you build and deepen your knowledge and develop your analytical abilities, ideally, because actually writing has not been studied as much as it should have been by cognitive psychologists, but they have studied some other phenomena that really overlap with writing. So, for example, there is a well-known effect called retrieval effect, or the testing effect or retrieval practice. Those are the two things it's known by. But basically, the idea is that when you try to recall things that you learned a little while ago, not just a second ago, but you've partially forgotten them, that in the act of trying to retrieve those things cements them in your long-term memory, really boosts retention. And another thing that cognitive psychologists describe is something called the protege effect, which is usually discussed in the context of having one student explain something to another. But the finding is that when you put something in your own words and explain it to somebody else, that again, it boosts your comprehension, also boosts your retention. It really cements things in your long-term memory. And both of those things definitely come into play when you're writing. You are retrieving things that you've partially forgotten and you're putting them in your own words. So really what writing can do is, really fill in some of those gaps in background knowledge, even at the high school level. Because, there's one thing, I think there's one metaphor I haven't mentioned yet, which I like, which is knowledge is like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. But if you don't have that related knowledge, the boost you get from writing can be so powerful that it kind of substitutes for that missing half of the Velcro. The caveat is that writing is the most difficult thing we ask kids to do in school. And we've really underestimated that. I mean, we kind of just expect them to pick it up if they read enough and just write enough. And for many kids, that doesn't happen. It needs to be taught explicitly, but it also needs to be divided into manageable chunks. And if kids do not yet know how to construct a good sentence, as many even in high school do not, that's where instruction needs to start. And that, even writing a sentence can be a very challenging activity. It all depends on the content, but it also modulates the cognitive load. If you're writing at length and you're an inexperienced writer, you're going to be so overwhelmed that you're probably not going to learn how to write well, nor are you going to have enough cognitive capacity available to really think about what you're writing about. But if you're given a sentence stem that's well designed, that'll really focus your attention on what's important and free up cognitive capacity so that you can actually analyze the content you're writing about.
So our best way of teaching writing then wouldn't be, hey, write a 5-paragraph essay on school uniforms. It would be having students write about the content or knowledge that they just learned about, even if it's scaffolded and saying something like, the Trail of Tears was horrible for American history because, or something like that. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And it also, by the way, there are high school students who don't really use conjunctions. They don't really know how to use even simple conjunctions in their own writing, or at least they don't do it. So having them finish a sentence with because or but, that also gives them practice in using conjunctions in their writing. But I mean, even just think about it. If you had to fill in the rest of that sentence, you'd really have to think about the Trail of Tears and then come up with a way of explaining it in your own words. And of course, if you use the conjunction but, it's a little bit harder because you have to come up with contrasting information.
That's super interesting because I think at some level, we say as middle school or high school teachers, like, oh, sentence frames are for elementary, right? Yeah. But they can be really, really powerful. What about free writing? What place do you feel like that has in the writing classroom? Like just, write today. Let's have a writing journal. I mean, is that an important piece of it? Like to just get them to write, or is it more important in school to have them writing about the content that they're learning?
I would say, and my co-author of The Writing Revolution, Judy Hockman, who developed this method of teaching writing and content at the same time, she would certainly say, we have a limited amount of time in school, and that kind of free writing is not the best use of most students' time. I mean, if it's a creative writing class in high school and students have already mastered the basics, fine. But, there's a place for brainstorming, but I wouldn't say that inexperienced writers should be just, they should do it in writing. I think discussion is probably, or maybe jotting down a few terms. But I think for a lot of kids, they confront a blank piece of paper and they feel kind of paralyzed because they don't know where to begin. Or if they do begin, what comes out is so incoherent and, just sort of difficult to understand that it's really not helping them become effective communicators at all.
I'm curious about, can you delineate what you believe to be the role of the teacher then, in the modern classroom? Say we've got the curriculum and assessments already in place. We've got a coherent content-based curriculum that's K through 12. What is ideally the role of the teacher, and what should PD look like too for them?
Mm-hmm. Well, the teacher, a lot of teachers have had this burden placed on them of creating curriculum as well as delivering it. And I think a lot of teacher training sort of gives them the idea that really the best teachers create their own curriculum to a large extent. But, really the as I mentioned before, that's a very hard thing for teachers to do, especially if they're not trained in creating curriculum, and it doesn't have that coherence that a multi-grade curriculum could have. But what teachers should be freed up to do is to devote their time and energy to figuring out how best to deliver the content that in the curriculum to their particular students. Kids are going to be coming in at different levels, certainly in writing or in background knowledge. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But also they need the kind of professional development that, a lot of professional development that goes on in this country is sometimes it's called drive-by or one-off or whatever. And it's disconnected from content as our approach to elementary reading comprehension has been. And it doesn't work any better for adults than it does for kids to say, okay, we're going to give you a workshop on how to teach critical thinking. It should be more like, okay, you're teaching the myth of Daedalus and Icarus or whatever. And how do you foster critical thinking about that particular myth? And I do think it's also needs to be ongoing. It's not just one workshop and then they're gone. It's teachers, I think, can benefit from good coaching and also from a sort of iterative process and collaborative process where they come together, they talk about something new they're going to try, they go to their classrooms, try it out, and then they come back and talk about how it went, what worked, what didn't work. Then they talk about another new thing they want to try, go back to their classrooms, and the cycle repeats.
It seems like there's a huge kind of swing in education now and they say, don't be the sage on the stage, be the guide on the side. And we're there to learn just as much as the students. And I appreciate what you're saying here. Just the idea that we are the experts and our role is what is the best way to get this amount of knowledge into the kids' heads in a way that it sticks.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I totally, agree with you that the teacher, should certainly be in possession of more information than the students and should be, sharing that and delivering that information. But at the same time, there is talk about having the students, do some of the lifting, the heavy lifting and struggle to some extent. And I think the trick is knowing when struggle is going to be productive and when it's not. Because at the same time that teachers are told, don't be the sage on the stage, they're also told learning should be an effortless, joyful process. And neither of those things is quite right. So teachers need to supply information that can serve as grist for the mill of students' own minds. But they then guide them through thinking about that information to a large extent on their own, and sometimes struggling with it, because without that struggle, there's no sense of accomplishment. And I think cognitive science has shown there's really no learning either without at least some element of struggle.
That's right.
Grist for the mind. That's probably the best way to leave off.
Mic drop.
I was just looking through our doc and literally 4.5 pages of Google Doc questions, and we're through a third of them, but we are hitting our time. So we're going to let you run on this. Where can our listeners go to learn from and with you?
Well, probably the best place is my website, which, should be easy to find because it's my name, nataliewexler.com. And that has links to, it will have a link to this podcast, but other podcast interviews, articles I've written. I do write regularly. I'm a contributor to Forbes.com. But all of that information is collected on the website.
Okay, Ben, let's close up shop. What'd you learn?
Well, as a social studies teacher, I just really rediscovered that the world really does revolve around me and my subject. I loved that it really emphasized the importance of content knowledge for sure, and thinking how often kids are pulled from social studies or science in order to do extra reading intervention. And that's probably the worst thing that we can do for kids. The other thing that really jumped out to me from this interview was when she talked about the idea of the Matthew principle, the rich get richer. And I've been geeking out recently just on this idea of compounding, that the better you are at something, the easier it is to keep getting better at it. The better shape you're in, the easier it is for you to push yourself really hard in a workout and get even in better shape. And the same is true with reading. The better reader you are, the easier it is for you to read harder passages and get even better at reading. So I just challenge us all to give kids that content-rich learning experience so they have the background knowledge to let it compound.
That's awesome.
How about you?
Well, and one thing I would be remiss not to say, I think some of the things that we talked about with Natalie in this episode, and some of the things that it's bringing to the forefront are kind of counterintuitive, because it's not what we learned in teacher prep programs, or it's not what we talk about on a daily basis in our classrooms. And I just want to give us all permission to, take this. All of these things are incredibly nuanced. Understand that it's not like we are all trying to do our best for students, and we do what we know how to do. And if we can incorporate even a little bit of this knowledge into our practice, I think we're going to go a long way. So, but really my takeaway for this, I feel like I do this a lot, but I'm going to use a quote from her book. It goes like this. It's not so much that particular bits of information are vital in and of themselves, although some certainly are. It's more that people need to have enough facts in their head to know what one commentator, or to have what one commentator has called a knowledge party, a bunch of accumulated associations that will enable them to absorb, retain, and analyze new information. Education certainly shouldn't end with facts, but if it doesn't begin there, many students will never acquire the knowledge and analytic abilities they need to thrive in both school and in life. End quote. I really love that. Like, education certainly shouldn't end with facts. Like, we get in arguments about that. Like, memorization isn't the most important thing. Of course not. But if it doesn't begin there, we're doing our students a disservice. So I like thinking about that knowledge party. And how, as experts too, if you think about like cognitive load theory, we can store really complex schema, and it takes up much less space in our working memory, so that we're able to be so much more creative with it. And I think sometimes, because of like cursive knowledge and just things that we get into habits as teachers, we don't think about that. And I really think we can't prioritize creativity if we're not also prioritizing knowledge. It's all about balance. I would bring up Fish again and the balance between careful practice and loose improvisation, but I'm afraid that Ben will make fun of me, so I'm not going to do that. We're just going to leave it there.
That is a really good choice on your part, because I definitely was going to. I think Knowledge Party has to be the name of this episode. That's brilliant. Yeah, for sure. Well, we would love if you would share this knowledge party with a friend, so we can all be more informed, inspired, and connected educators. And as always, have a great generic time of day.